And still with our guests here, Ambassador Avi Pazner and Dan Perry. And Dan, coming to you on this topic here now about the Holocaust, about Germany's role in Holocaust remembrance. And President Steinmeier himself in his various roles has been such an upfront figure in that arena here. And Germany really does stand out, I hate to say ironically, but in 2021, the Germans seem to be the flag bearers of Holocaust remembrance in Europe, certainly in light of recent issues with Poland and other countries and trying to legislate the way that history can be discussed. How do you see the importance of Germany's role in this discussion around the Holocaust?
Well, I mean, the history of Germany with the Jews and with Israel tests to the absolute breaking point the idea that one is not responsible for the sins of antecedents. So even though today's Germans can't be reasonably blamed for the Nazis, there isn't a relationship in general, as has been alluded before just in this program. The acceptance that just as an individual or a nation can inherit assets, so can it inherit sort of a guilt-based obligation. And that is probably what's driving a quite extraordinary German friendliness towards Israel. You see that in the economic relationship as mentioned. You see it in close military ties. You see it in Germany's acquiescence and patience with Israel's otherwise unpopular attitudes towards the Palestinians in the West Bank and towards Gaza. And you certainly see it in the question of anti-Semitism. Not only does Germany act like a country that wants to be on the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism, but also they're very quick to react to anti-Semitism within Germany. And on the whole, although I wouldn't diminish the dangers that do exist in Germany, you see much less agitation among the Jewish community in Germany about it than you do, for example, in France, which with a similar sized community has much more angst and much higher Jewish immigration to Israel and fairly quick action when things do happen. For example, the soldiers in Lithuania, I believe, were singing anti-Semitic songs or something. The action was very, very quick. When there was an attack on a synagogue in Halle, you saw the immediate reaction and lessons learned from the authorities, both regionally and across the country, and quick condemnation of any anti-Semitic activity or statement, be it by the far-right AfD or by the Muslim community in Germany and so forth. I think it's important, and Germany certainly acts like it knows it.
Dan Perry still with us here, looking at Israeli diplomacy on display, certainly for this new government and foreign ministry in particular under alternate prime minister and foreign minister Yair Lapid. Here we are seeing the Germans sending a very high-level delegation to the country. Foreign Minister Lapid having just returned from the United Arab Emirates. Now, what's your impression of perhaps a new era of foreign relations? We know that Lapid himself has talked about fixing relations with the United States in particular, but it appears they're out to really, meet the world diplomatically here. How's the start of those efforts look to you?
Oh, I think they look very promising indeed. There's no question that the world tends to be happier with a center-left government in Israel because of the Palestinian issue. That attaches also partly to why Rivlin is unpopular. He comes from the right, but he projects a sort of moralistic view of the world and has underplayed his own right-wing specific ideological past. And he was a counterbalance to the relatively unpopular Netanyahu, certainly in Europe. So I think Germany, like the rest of Europe, is happy to see the change of government in Israel. This is not a center-left government in the classic sense, but it does project a certain zeitgeist of the non-right in Israel, despite the identity still yet to be formed on the world stage of Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Yair Lapid certainly does project that. And so even though, as I said before, Germany has been sort of patient with Israel and reluctant to criticize it too much, certainly compared to other European countries that have been strident, I think they too are happy with the prospects of a friendlier, more sort of European-oriented, more Western-oriented, more pragmatic Israel, and so the prospects there are very, very good. Regarding Steinmeier, I have to say he plays a slightly analogous role to what Rivlin has played at a time of instability in Israel, because he comes here at a moment when there's some uncertainty in the executive branch in Germany. There are national elections in the fall. And after 16 years of Angela Merkel, she's stepping down amid some uncertainty about what the result would be. It's interesting over there because you have a fragmentation that prevents a natural majority. Then it can throw up weird alliances. We have everything being skewed by the existence of two parties, the far left and the far right, that are currently being boycotted by all the others. You have rather unstable polls, with the Greens for a time a few months ago having polled better than the generally plurality enjoying CDU, Angela Merkel CDU. So elements of this very strange and unpredictable scene are somewhat reminiscent of Israel. And Steinmeier is not only friendly overall, but he represents a little bit like Rivlin, sort of a rock of stability.
Now, talking about Iran here, and certainly Germany's interesting role involved in that now, and it seems, there's indications at least, that the German government views Israel's concerns in a favorable light here. But how does that seem across Europe, and how important is it for the Europeans to sort of understand Israel's side of this issue?
I think the Europeans want to be an active part of this. I think it's relevant that when the U.S. walked away from the deal, it didn't totally fall apart. I think there's understanding in the U.S. as well that after the 4 years of Trump, there is a need to be a little bit more multilateral. So they'll take Europe into account. And I think in Europe, there is a lot of sympathy for Israel's position. I mean, Netanyahu specifically clouded the issue a little bit with logically absurd statements such as that the previous deal, practically invited Iran to rush to a bomb upon expiration, whereas it was obvious it was meant to be renewed. On the more brass tacks and less propagandistic issues of Iran's behavior around the region as a bully, its interferences in Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon and Syria, and long-range missiles that also threaten Europe, I think there is an understanding in Europe that it would be better if Iran were restrained in that way, and that is essentially the crux of Israel's position. I think we can expect Germany to be the leader here, both for the political reasons that we mentioned before, its special relationship with Israel, but also because it has, beyond moral suasion, it has a lot of economic clout with both Israel, by the way, where it is the number 3 exporter to Israel, number 5 importer from Israel worldwide, and with Iran.
Back to you, Dan, on the issues of the international relations between Israel and Europe in particular, as the Israelis try to gain European positive sentiment towards the concerns here. Now, there was much said during certainly the ending phase of Prime Minister Netanyahu's role as Prime Minister here in the recent time. His campaign's almost saying, these foreign relations depend on me. Without me, those may fall apart. Is there a sense under this new government now that there's some of those relations at risk, or that the Europeans are still there, that these foreign relations are ongoing? Where do you think those things stand right now?
Well, I think we're looking at something of a reboot, not unlike what happened with the transition from Trump to Biden. Netanyahu was basically viewed as, in a way, as part of the axis of authoritarian democracies like Hungary, Poland, and some other countries not in Europe. I mean, clearly not as bad as Putin, nor even close, but there was an element of that, and he was certainly friendly to those leaders, which created angst among, in particular, the Western European leaderships. And I think there was a sense that Israel is wishing now to return to that fold, more Germany, France, and Britain, and less, Orban's Hungary and a law and justice version of Poland. So I think there's a lot of potential there for a genuine reboot. The danger in Europe, I think, comes from the youth. I mean, and again, Germany is a little bit different here. You have in Germany much less of the phenomenon of rabid opposition to Israel from a dominant far left on campuses, which is a huge issue in the UK, and which is also coming in a way that will probably shock many Israelis in the United States. And I think the new government, if it is wise, will do something to tackle that issue, to try to restore friendly attitudes towards Israel among the younger people in Europe.
The points you mentioned earlier, that's viewed favorably. A center-left government opens perhaps some doors for Israel in Europe. Is it being looked at as a fascinating phenomena that they're trying to understand? What's your impression?
They are trying to understand it, of course, and I think they're also hoping. They're hoping that Bennett will pull an Ariel Sharon or an Olmert or a Tzipi Livni and somehow emerge as a right-winger of a more classical bent, not like the current populist version of the right that is spreading like wildfire around the world. I think they're kind of hoping he can flip and be not just a cynical addition to the center left that enabled them to defenestrate Netanyahu, but more of a realignment of Israeli politics, where pragmatic people align on one side and you don't worry so much about right-left labels, and the populists, who are unpopular among most of the leadership of Western Europe and also right now in the U.S., become a natural minority as opposed to a natural majority. They're hoping Bennett will, in effect, join Lapid on the same side as opposed to be part of a government of all sides. I don't know if that's realistic. A lot depends on Bennett himself. Part of the dynamic is that he's lost his voters, many of them for sure. So I think Bennett may be thinking, well, as a right winger, as the religious right in Israel, I no longer have voters. Maybe as a new version of Ariel Sharon, I do. And that might impact what he's able to do. And if he moves in that direction, that'll make him very popular internationally.
Bennett and Lapid obviously had to display some great unity between just the two of them to get this thing put together now. It's the first few weeks, as we've seen Lapid really on the diplomatic path, very active so far in his role as foreign minister, and the prime minister himself, Bennett, as well. Not shy of the cameras, not shy of the main issues at this point. They seem to be on the same page so far.
They're on the same page of projecting a new type of voice in Israel, not the strident sort of politics of division, but a sort of good karma type of atmosphere that both of them are trying, I think successfully, to project. You saw this, by the way, in Lapid, rather generously, but also very cleverly praising Netanyahu down in the United Arab Emirates for his work in creating the Abraham Accords. That's the kind of, generosity of spirit, the projected generosity of spirit that you weren't likely to hear from the former Likud government. I think Bennett shares that. It's yet to be seen if they can come together on policy when it comes to the very difficult issue of the Palestinians, but perhaps so, because Lapid is not that far left, and my sense is that Bennett may not be that far right. So it's impossible to predict, but I think if nothing else, the fear of a return of Likud and of Netanyahu politics may be enough to cement this alliance for quite some time.
Thank you for that, Dan Perry and Ambassador Posner. On that topic that Dan touches on here, the Palestinians, which President Steinmeier brought up very pointedly in his comments there, saying that the German government's still in favor of a two-state solution, almost arguing that there hasn't been an alternative put forward yet. He hasn't seen that alternative solution. Let's listen in, though, for just a moment here. Yeah.